Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. I'm on my way back from the library, having dropped off a couple books, and I am anxious to talk to you. I thought I would talk to you today about something that was last week kind of a big hubbub in the right part of board game media, if you follow it, and that was the controversy regarding and Aeon Trespass Odyssey and the YouTube channel Quackalope. What I thought I would talk about today is just give you a brief back of the envelope idea of what happened and how it was resolved, and then talk a little bit about my view on various aspects of board game reviewing and media and ethics in game journalism. It's interesting to think about this emerging now because one inevitably makes on some level a connection back to the Gamergate controversy of 2014, in which an argument about ethics in game journalism was used as cover for what started out as a personal assassination piece or a personal character assassination piece by a disgruntled boyfriend, and ended up being a rampaging monster of anti-feminist critique and misogynistic harassment hidden under the guise of a concern for journalistic ethics. And so one of the things I want to think about very carefully is making sure that nowhere in this conversation is there cover for that sort of malarkey. And I would say generally there has not been. I will acknowledge the one thing though, that Jesse from Quackalope was when this controversy happened in Jerusalem studying at a yeshiva. Apologies if I got that term wrong. And so I think that in some places there has been some anti-Semitism, but my understanding that for the most part there has not, and I didn't see any myself, except to say that the Board Game Geek thread about this, which ran into the 40s in terms of pages, had quite a few blocked entries that were deleted by moderators. So I presume some of those were horrifying, just because the internet is horrifying. Nonetheless, essentially what happened is the board game publisher, or I'll reveal it in the way that it came to light to the public, which is that during the Kickstarter campaign for Aeon's Trespass Odyssey, the YouTube channel Quackalope, which had the original game, which was done on Kickstarter, and now there is a new game coming out that's an expansion along with a reprint of the original. The YouTube channel Quackalope, which does playthroughs and reviews and whatnot, released a couple playthroughs, released a comparison video between this game and Kingdom Death Monster, which it looks to be kind of in the same genre, and then a two-part review in a format they call confirmation bias. And essentially what they do is they take all of the positive things they have to say about the game and they stick them into the positive side of the confirmation bias review. And then they take the negative things they have to say about the game and put them in the negative side. So you can watch the one that says why Aeon's Trespass has a 9.3 on Board Game Geek. I think the title was Aeon's Trespass is a Masterpiece. And then this is the one that garnered the most controversy, Aeon's Trespass is unplayable. And it starts out with the host saying, this might be the worst game I've ever played, something like that. So when that video came out, the backers of the upcoming campaign were mad about it, and some of them were incensed because they had the game and they did not feel that the channel's review was fair. And so they went on the Kickstarter campaign and said, hey, what's up with this review? Why is this guy such a jerk? And the company that makes the game said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, but something to the effect of, when somebody tells you they have a negative review that they'll take down if you pay them $7,500 to make good videos, you don't want to work with that person anymore. And that offhanded comment started a cavalcade of conversation in which people demanded receipts, because making a charge like that is pretty strong. And the company showed up with the email exchange, which I think to most people does in fact reflect the interpretation they had, although Then, of course, the YouTube channel, Jesse at Quackalope, published an apology in which he said we weren't trying to extort them, but the language has mostly been blackmail or extortion, the idea that Jesse had filmed a negative review, or as he described it, a review about the game in which they had a lot of trouble playing it. The implication was it was a negative review, and that they would be willing to scrap that material and start over filming new stuff if they got a sponsorship deal with the company for $7,500. That's where the argument comes from. I don't think anybody watching this would dispute that those are the sort of basic facts of the case. With the exception, there do appear to be a couple people who think that Jesse never actually said his review was negative or said he would take down his review. But he certainly did say we'd scrap the existing footage and start over. So this started, like I said, a controversy that is probably still echoing today if you go look around Board Game Geek or other board game forums. I don't want to go into it more than what I've just said there. I'll let you go peruse those things if you are interested in learning more. What I did want to talk about, though, is a little bit of my impression or what I think about the board game review landscape and how reviews and content are created. Because the board game area is so small, there is a lot of overlap between different categories of board game creators and producers. I have myself on this podcast expressed a number of times hesitancy over using the word review because I am inherently biased as a board game creator and a part owner of a publishing company in the board game landscape, that any competition to my games is on some level bad for me, or, takes away some percent of the market share I might be able to get, perhaps. And so I have, on some level, a bias that can affect my ability to review games. So arguably I shouldn't review games. And for a while I tried very hard not to say the things that I do were reviews. Now the reality of it is I'm treating them like reviews. So I do call them first look reviews, right? I'm using that language now. Probably what I need to do is be much more overt about that potential bias. So listeners tuning into any particular episode would be able to identify that and use it for themselves to judge whether they think I am a trustworthy media creator. That isn't something I've done super well, I don't think. So I will try to do that better in future. And it occurs to me I didn't even do it in the Board Game Espresso episode that I recorded 20 minutes ago. So, oops. But I thought I would talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that reviewers might be biased and how different reviewing entities have dealt with that potential bias. First one, and this is the one that seems to be, for me, I think this one's the least consequential, but depending on the board game, on the reviewer themselves, or on the audience member, some people find this particularly galling, is review copies. Now, most people who do board game reviewing at any level of significance in terms of audience share start to receive review copies from publishers. And the review copy is, of course, a copy of the game given to you to free as a reviewer so that you can review the game. Now, legally in the United States, there cannot be an implication of quid pro quo there. There can be no means by which the publisher can say, hey, if you don't give us a good review, we will, not send you review copies anymore. They can't say, here's a copy as long as you give us a good review. However, I have heard in conversations about this from different board game media producers that it is not at all uncommon for publishers to stop sending review copies to people who review their games badly. Which, is an interesting place to be as a publisher, because on the one hand, as a publisher, when you're giving out a review copy, you want people to read the reviews, or you want people to do reviews and do them well. And if somebody does a negative review of your game, it's probably worth at least examining, is this person in the right audience for this game? Paul Grogan plays all these heavy, deep Euros. If we make a light, fun party game, is Paul Grogan the right audience for a review copy of that game? Now, if we send him one light party game and he bashes it, then the question is it worth sending him a second one if we think he's not going to review it well? In fact, I remember reading Jamie Stegmaier as a publisher doesn't read reviews, but I don't know how he determines who should get review copies. He likes to encourage newer channels sometimes, but I think he also sends them to established channels. I don't know what his criteria are. I did read that he actively doesn't read reviews to keep himself from accidentally engaging in that kind of bias. Now, as a reviewer, there are two dangers with the bias of review copies. One is that you will value the game too lightly because you did not pay for it. And so you might enjoy a game in a different way than if you felt like you had a stake in the game from having paid for it. Now, I don't know if the argument would be that if I pay $100 for a game, I am incentivized to like it more than a reviewer who got it for free. And so the reviewer's view would be more pure, perhaps. But on the other hand, if as a reviewer, you make money off of the games that you get, which you could do by, say, reselling them or trading them for games that you want, then there is a disincentive to write a bad review if you think the publisher might penalize you for it. Because you write a bad review, you get penalized and you don't get as many review copies. Or even if you don't think the publisher will, even if you don't make money on it, you make money by having the latest and greatest. And so if you get off of the publisher wish list, then you don't get the game until all the other schmoes who buy it at the store do. And your ability to publish that opening day review is dramatically diminished. So review copies themselves do create a bias that's worth talking about, which is why I think every media creator should be revealing when they are playing a copy that they received as a review copy, and good review groups tend to do that. Next up is sponsorships, and there are a couple different kinds of sponsorships. There is sponsored content and then just general advertisement with the group. So for example, sponsored content would be the kind of stuff that is often on the Quackalope channel, which is where they have been hired by the company to make and post material about a particular game. And so good production of that content would involve making clear to the viewer that they have been paid to produce that content. Now, that content should not be a review. Generally, there are actually legal, as I understand it, legal limits or legal barriers between reviews and paid content. And a review is not supposed to be paid content, but it is almost inevitable that people doing this kind of work will often reveal their thoughts about a game one way or another. And in paid content, it's rarely negative thoughts about the game. Sometimes it is, but rarely. Now, of course, I would say good versions of producing this content would be to say up front, I was paid to produce this content. So take anything I say that's not directly about the game with a grain of salt. Or more dramatically, very directly not saying anything about the quality of the game. That you are just presenting the game as an experience and letting users make up their own mind. So that would be sponsored content. And then you have advertisement, which is a classic issue in terms of conflict of interest. You think about TV news channels, the idea that the editorial and news sections of a news organization are supposed to be behind a kind of wall with advertisers so that there's no conflict of interest where an advertiser doesn't want to advertise with the paper anymore if the newspaper writes a bad article about them. And the same goes for board game media that accepts advertisement from board game companies, right? If a board game YouTube channel takes ads from a board game company, particularly ads where they've been paid directly, as opposed to, say, YouTube serving ads into their feed, which often you don't get control of as far as I understand it. If you were to have a sponsorship, like through advertisement of a particular brand, then it would not be ideal for that reviewer to then publish a bad review of that company's games. They should be able to do that, but the reality is that a bias can be created when one finds oneself in that situation. And then finally, I did want to take a moment here to talk about Alex from Board Game Co. made a video about this, particularly in response to the Quackalope situation, talking about where one could see biases in his work and one has to decide. And he's got a number of things he works. His job outside of board game reviewing is working for a crowdfunding platform. And so when he does anything for a game that's on that crowdfunding platform, He has an inherent conflict of interest that should be made clear to the readers or listeners. But more generally, some people see him as just tainted by the fact that he works in board games. And, by that regard too, my part ownership of a board game company may taint my review voice and is worth thinking about when you're listening to me review something. More dramatically, and I think Alex very forthrightly and earnestly reflects this idea that the bigger worry about bias is not a business relationship, right? He feels like if he's paid to do content of a game and then later he reviews that game, he feels like he's generally able to distinguish between the two and be fair in that distinction. However, what he says is harder is the relationships that emerge in the board game community. So the board game industry is really small. And if you go to cons, particularly as a media creator with some access, you can very quickly meet and become friends with a lot of the people who make the thing that you then are reviewing. And he says that is the harder bias to overcome, is if you are friends with someone and they put out a bad game, the risk to that friendship of putting out that bad game, of putting out a review of that bad game, is higher. And again, he says he works hard on that, but it is difficult. So I respect him for calling that out. So to wrap this up here, I wanted to talk about a couple different reviewers who I think have the highest standard of ethical separation. The first is going to be So Very Wrong About Games. I think they do a couple things to really maintain a very high standard of reviewer integrity. One, they are very open about any relationship they have with any game they publish. When they review a game, this game was sent to us by the publisher, it was sent to us by the designer. One of the main guys from that, Mark, is friends with the designer of Spirit Island. So even though Spirit Island is one of his favorite games, he says every single time he mentions Spirit Island, designed by Eric Rice, a personal friend of mine. He outs that distinction every single time he mentions it. And they do this consistently. Two, they do not generally cultivate a lot of relationships with publishers. They have some relationships with other media creators. They have very little in the way of relationships with publishers or publishing people. And this is deliberate. This is part of their goal of maintaining the ability to be frank in their reviewing voice. The third thing is that they don't have financial relationships with any board game companies other than through review copies. They don't accept advertisement. They don't do sponsored content. They do have advertisements on their podcast, but they are served through a feed in their podcast publisher, and they are not about board games. So they actually have a further line they draw where they won't take advertising from board games because they need to keep that maintained. So I would put them at the kind of the highest echelon. And very close to them, I would say, are Shut Up and Sit Down and No Pun Included, both of which are similarly podcast and video venues that do reviews but don't generally have paid relationships with publishers. Now, Shut Up and Sit Down does do a bit more connecting with publishers. They have connected a little bit more with designers. They may have done one or two paid things, although I think not. Like there was a lot of discussion about their glowing preview of Blood on the Clock Tower, and people were very critical of that, in part because they seemed to know the designers. But apparently they insist they weren't paid for that work. So, and No Pun Included, I think, is in the same boat. That they are funded by their audience. They don't get paid by publishers. The most they get is review copies of games. And in fact, No Pun Included has indicated they often don't get review copies anymore either because they don't want the pressure of having to review them on a schedule, or they are too lazy to go through the effort of doing it, so they end up just buying their games. And then the other way that I think reviewers can maintain a very solid wall of distinction between the different podcasts, or between their different potential biases, is to not do reviews at all. And the example of this would be like John Gets Games. I think he does this mostly, although he might do a little bit of reviewing. Or the gold standard is Rodney Smith. Rodney Smith is a YouTube board game personality, and on his channel Watch It Played, he does not do reviews. Now that water has become muddied a little bit I think, by some of the videos that he and his crew make on Watch It Played, but these tend to be news-focused videos that maybe reflect the tastes of the people, but they don't reflect reviews. So like they'll do the top 5 things I'm excited about this month. That is a long way from a review. They will kind of highlight what's going on, but they don't review them. The 2 different media creators who do have fiscal relationships with publishing companies and who express editorial opinion content that I sort of have come to terms with where they are is Blue Peg Pink Peg and the Rahdo Runs Through channel. On Blue Peg Pink Peg, theirs is the form of sponsorship that they have advertising, or their episodes are sponsored by publishers. They have 3 publishers that they work with most of the time. The Secret Cabal is also in this tier. So they have publishers that they work with who sponsor episodes, and they talk about who is sponsoring the episode, and they talk about them, and then they do ads for those. And those are very clearly delineated in the episode when it's an ad. So that's not a problem per se. The place where it could become an issue, I suppose, would be in the reviewing of games from those publishers. For example, Queen Games is one of the sponsors of the Blue Pig Pink Pig podcast, and they regularly review games published by Queen Games. The same is true of games from Grand Gamers Guild, although less often. I think Blue Pig Pink Pig does a pretty good job of reminding us that these are sponsors of the show, although I can't recall if during the last review of a Queen game, if they reminded us, and of course remember Queen Games is one of the sponsors of Blue Pig Pink Pig. I don't recall them reminding us of that during the review itself. They might have, but I don't remember it. Nonetheless, I feel like they do a pretty good job of calling out who their sponsors are and maintaining generally a pretty good limit, or at least expressing when they have close social relationships with the producers. For example, Blue Pig Pink Pig has a very good relationship with Connor McGooey of Inside Up Games, and when they review one of the Inside Up games, they always mention that. So it feels like Blue Pig Pink Pig is staying on the right side of that line, but has practices that are a little bit less chaste than, say, Shut Up, So Very Wrong About Games. And then the last one I want to talk about is Rahdo, Richard Ham, Rahdo Runs Through. So Rahdo has always had a sort of interesting approach in that his primary form of media, of video that he produces is called a run-through, in which he plays the game and you watch him play the game to figure out if you'd like the game. What's interesting about this mode is that it's not meant to be editorial, but after each play he does another video called Final Thoughts where he does editorialize on the game a little bit. He talks about what he liked about it and what he didn't like about it. And for a long time he did those run-throughs for free. He just did them because he felt like it. If it was a Kickstarter and he thought it sounded interesting, he would do it for free, and he was sponsored by his channel. In the last few years, specifically for Kickstarters, not for published games, Rahdo has started charging a fee to do run-throughs for Kickstarter games. He is very upfront about when a Kickstarter is paid. And, I think in terms of maintaining the appropriate level of distance, he manages that. But it is, again, a little bit more complicated because he gets paid. Now, one thing I think that he does that's really good about that is at the end of the month, each month, they do a top 10 games of each person does a top 5 or top 10 games for themselves of that month. Or they rate all the games they played that month and put them in order. And one of the things they do on the channel is all the paid content does not get into that list. So they take the paid content and they put it in a separate list, and then they talk about the games they played. I can't recall if his top 10, I know in his top 10 he does mention which games were paid, but I think he still does put them in order. So Rahdo is a little bit more mixed. He is very clear which parts he's being paid for and which parts he's doing on his own. But again, that line is murkier than the sort of very religious distinction that's drawn by those sort of top tier creators I mentioned. So I'm curious to think, what do you think about the current state of affairs of board game reviewing, board game media? Would you like to see people being more careful or more overt about where their fiscal relationships lie? I'm just curious what you think about all of this. Maybe most importantly, do you think I need to change anything about the way I do? Is there anything I do that makes you suspicious or uncomfortable about my reviews or my, game discussion habit? I'd be interested to hear if you found yourself thinking about that in the context of pick up and deliver. So thanks for, the way you can do that is to head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and post those ideas in our guild. You could also email me, Brendan at Rattlemox Games, or send me a direct message on Board Game Geek. Wombat929 is my username there. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.